Paul says, "We think you ought to know, dear brothers and sisters, about the trouble we went through in the province of Asia." So, what were those troubles Paul was facing? Well, he doesn't say it explicitly, but it's pretty clear that he's referring to the craziness he experienced with Demetrius in Ephesus over the goddess Artemis. Okay, so Luke wrote about this in Acts chapter 19, verses 21 through 24. So Paul just arrived in Ephesus with a few of his friends, and they were telling everybody about Jesus, about how he was crucified by the Romans, and he was in the grave for 3 days, but he didn't stay there. God delivered Jesus from death. He raised Jesus to life again. And so Paul was telling everybody that Jesus was trustworthy and that all these other gods that they were giving sacrifices to and worshiping, they weren't needed anymore. Now, this upset a lot of people. A lot of people accepted Paul's message and put their faith into Jesus, but a lot of other people were very angry with Paul and his friends. Demetrius was very, very angry because he was a silversmith. And his whole job revolved around making altars for people to sacrifice to Artemis. This was the Roman goddess Diana, the god of warfare and fertility. And so he was big business. He employed a lot of other tradesmen. And so when he saw people turning to Jesus, he did the math and he realized his business was going to take a hit. So he gathered all his employees together and said, "Hey, we got to do something about Paul. This guy that's coming in preaching about this guy named Jesus, calling him a god, he's going to steal our business." And so then Demetrius got all the other tradesmen together from all the other places that would be affected by this. And he whipped them into a frenzy saying, "We've got to do something now." And so what they did is they went looking for Paul and his friends. They didn't find Paul initially, but they found 2 of his friends and they drug his friends into the auditorium. And all of these people came to find out what's going on. And Demetrius whipped them all into a frenzy. He started a riot in the auditorium and they all started chanting for Paul's friends to be put to death. Now, Paul heard about it and he started rushing to the auditorium. But the new believers stopped Paul and said, "You can't go in there. You're going to die." So Paul's in an impossible situation. He can't just let his friends be killed, but if he goes in there, he's going to be killed. So it's either he's got this impossible decision to make. Do I just stand by and let my friends die? Or do I go in there and all of us die together? And knowing Paul, it doesn't say this in the text, but knowing Paul, I bet you anything at that point is when he prayed. Because all of a sudden the tide changed. And what seemed like there was no way out, all of a sudden God made a way. God delivered Paul. What happened is the governor of Ephesus came in and quieted the crowd. And he said, "Hey, if you guys don't cut it out, what's going to happen is the Roman authorities are going to hear about this. Soldiers are going to come in and they're going to put us down for rioting. So we need to disperse." And sure enough, everybody left the auditorium. Paul's life was spared and his traveling companion's life was spared as well. So why did Paul want the church in Corinth to know about his troubles? Well, Paul's really answering the question, why do bad things happen to good people? There were actually people telling the Corinthian Christians that Paul suffered because he was a bad person. People were actually telling the Corinthian Christians that it was obvious that Paul wasn't a good person because he faced so much suffering. They contested that good people were blessed and bad people were cursed. They were convinced that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. It was an early iteration of the health and wealth gospel. So Paul needed to address the question, why do bad things happen to good people? Or more personally, why were bad things happening to him if he wasn't a terrible person? Paul gives us a different perspective on suffering than was popular at the time or popular now. He actually aligned himself with the teaching of Jesus, that those who are persecuted are actually blessed. Those who suffer will be comforted. They're blessed. Paul doesn't minimize his suffering, but he gives purpose to his pain. Look at how bad it got and look at the good that came from it. Verse 9. "In fact, we expected to die, but as a result, we stopped relying on ourselves and learned to rely only on God who raises the dead." It got so bad, Paul was so in over his head that he couldn't see a way out. He thought he was going to die, but he didn't die. God delivered him. But in the process, Paul learned something that he treasured. Paul learned God's trustworthy. you can fully rely on God. When you're in over your head, when you can't see a way out, when you definitely don't have it within yourself to fix a situation, even when all else will fail you, you can rely on God.